Coinbase first came out, I like to play with technology. I'm a tech geek and have been for a long time. And so I tried it. Some people sent me some Bitcoin because it was dirt cheap back then and wanted me to see it. But the conversation back then was mostly about it becoming a currency. And, that's why they're called cryptocurrencies, which is really a misnomer, right? Because very few of them, if any of them, are actually currencies. And so as somebody who had written software, and I did a lot with distributed databases, my very first company, we were a systems integrator. So I would write, multi-user applications, distributed applications. And then I sold my company to CompuServe, which had a worldwide network that Visa was on. And, I did a lot of business with Lotus Notes, which had replication servers. And so I really had an understanding, not as much as some people, but what I felt was a strong understanding on distributed databases and, decentralized databases. And so I was all in on blockchain. But like any other new programming language or platform or anything, there was a long ways to go before, blockchain was really going to be ubiquitous. But, even back in the beginning, I remember getting into arguments with people at South by Southwest back then. I was all in on blockchain, but the argument on Bitcoin in particular was always it was going to be a currency. And over the next 5 years, I was certainly a naysayer. And to this day, I'm not a believer that Bitcoin will become a currency. And most Bitcoiners aren't even saying it's a currency anymore. And when they had the split in 2017, that kind of confirmed, right? You're not going to do it. And, I've listened to all the talk about Lightning over the years and how that was going to change everything. And, it just hasn't. So, long story short, what really started to change was even after 2017 and the big price movements, over the last year or so, you've seen people maybe 2 years, only start to refer to Bitcoin as a store of value. Nobody's really talking up the whole currency thing any longer. At the Dallas Mavericks, we started taking Bitcoin for tickets and other purchases back in, I think, 2015. And I think ever since then, we've sold maybe $300 worth. People just don't want it. And I did it because I wanted to see if people would actually use it as a currency. And, back then, some people tried. You had people going across the country trying to live off of Bitcoin and all that, but now people are like, no, I'm not going to spend my Bitcoin as a currency. I want to see it appreciate. So what really changed was, one, watching people change their mind about it being a currency and start recognizing that it's only a store of value. And two, starting to see the maturation of blockchain apps, particularly on Ethereum. And then three, this past summer, watching DeFi go nuts. So for me, DeFi really was, okay, now blockchain in particular is really starting to mature. You're starting to see applications that are really coming into play. You're starting to see NFT, and it's not so much just about how much is sold and gross market value, but more just that people are becoming more comfortable with it. And so we're starting to see these applications that are just popping up left and right. And it reminded me so much of the early days of the internet where, the mid-90s, people started talking about internet applications, but the internet had been around for 10 years, right? But it was mostly in universities. And so it was very analogous to what's going on with blockchain. You had early adopter applications, you had banks and private organizations trying to use blockchain. You had people trying to come up with, new ways to use it. And then bam, smart contracts came along and it just blew up. And Bitcoin no longer was all about, well, it's going to be a currency, and then people would argue about the block size and all that shit, right? It was more now, okay, what can smart contracts do? And now that people have come up with these ideas and people are starting to put money into it, you're really starting to see it. So that's what's got me really excited lately. So here's where I'm a skeptic, right? First, whenever somebody would argue it was going to be a currency, that's where I was a skeptic, right? Because put aside the transactional issues and speed of transaction and cost of transaction, right? That's one thing. And even the complexity side of it, that's another thing, right? People don't fully understand wallets, and even with the MetaMask and everything, it's still complicated for a lot of people, and dealing with keys and, seed words and all that kind of stuff, physical keys, it gets really complicated. But where you see me really start to get skeptical still when it comes to Bitcoin in particular is the whole thing where people like to talk about fiat, right? Well, there's so much inflation in fiat and there's so much money printing that this is a hedge against fiat, which is the exact argument that gold bugs make, right? And I just disagree with that completely. I don't think that there's any correlation between what happens with the Federal Reserve and what happens with the price of Bitcoin. And you hear me say it all the time, and it gets people mad. I said, well, it's just supply and demand. And they're like, well, of course it's just supply and demand, just like everything else. But the reality is, most fiat money is digital right now.
Yeah.
Period, end of story, right? And there will be a point, I believe, when sovereign governments have their own digital coins, because it's going to be cheaper. We lose money on every penny minted. We lose money on every nickel minted, right? There's just so much cost and stupidity associated with how we've always done those things. But it's not an inflationary issue, right? And that's where I really start. And if you look at gold, right, there's been scenarios where people thought, oh, gold will really appreciate now because, inflation is this or inflation. It just doesn't happen. If everything went to hell in a handbasket and we tried to use gold, people just hit you over your head and take your gold. But the reality is reserve currencies tend to stick around for as long as they're reserve currencies. And there's always multiple currencies that then become, if one falters, another one stays there, pops up, right? You have China doing their best to become a reserve currency. You have the United States doing its best to sustain itself as a reserve currency. I'm not a currency historian, but you've got the British pound that's been around for generations, for hundreds of years. Used to be a reserve currency, but hasn't collapsed yet. It's gone up and down, right, relative to the euro and relative to the dollar, but where you've seen currencies collapse like Argentina and other places, right, or Venezuela or wherever, you've seen some Bitcoin being used because it's available and accessible, but at the end of the day, it's always pegged to the dollar. And no matter what, in order to spend it, you've got to convert it to whatever that reserve currency is going to be. So, you can hope that Bitcoin increases in value faster than the dollar or whatever inflates, but you don't know that for certain, right? And there's so many uncertainties there that you can create the story that's saying, well, what else would it be, right? But gold bugs would tell you it's going to be gold. Right. And someone else would tell you it could be platinum, whatever, because commodities should inflate at the same rate that inflation is, right?